Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to you all for this first of an annual lecture series dedicated to Islam and its relationship with Christianity. With tonight's event, we officially inaugurate the Terence Nichols Memorial Symposium. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning. In years past, a lecture like this would have been sponsored by the Muslim-Christian Dialogue Center. Various factors have led to the Theology Department's decision earlier this year to transform the Muslim-Christian Dialogue Center into a Theological Encounters initiative, not least of which is the loss of its co-director due to untimely death or its co-directors, due to the untimely death of our beloved colleague Terry Nichols in 1214. That's 5 years ago, I guess 5 days ago. Right? Is that we're celebrating? And the return of Adil Özdemir to his home country of Turkey shortly afterwards. By then, the J. Phillips Center had broadened its focus from Jewish-Christian relations to interfaith learning, which includes the dialogue between Muslims and Christians. The scope of the center for ministry broadened its outreach to Muslim students on campus and now has a Muslim chaplain, Dr. Sadaf Sharim. The Office of Spirituality and Interfaith Council are doing interfaith work among Muslims and Christians on campus. Together, these offices are now doing the work that was part of the original mission of the Muslim-Christian Dialogue Center. Encountering Islam is the first program of a larger Theological Encounters initiative. Through this program, we will then organize a number of co-curricular events to provide the opportunities for students to learn about Islam and or Muslim-Christian dialogue through the convocation, Our Conversations, Theology Night Live discussions, Theology Club conversations, evening events, etc. Another major focus of the Encountering Islam program is the establishment of the Terence Nichols Memorial Symposium, which tonight's event inaugurates. Each year, we will invite a scholar of Islam to be a resident at St. Thomas for up to a week. His or her primary task will be to give a public lecture on a topic related to Islam or on Muslim-Christian dialogue. The scholar will have an opportunity to engage with university administrators, faculty, staff, and students, and will also give a workshop on some aspect of Islam and or Muslim-Christian dialogue for the theology faculty. The symposium is named after Dr. Terence Nichols, former chair of the theology department. He was co-director of the Muslim-Christian Dialogue Center from 27 until his death in 1214. And as we were discussing at the dinner that we had previously here, Terry gave his heart and soul to this dialogue with Muslims. And so we dedicate this yearly lecture series to his memory. We have present here in the back row a special guest of Terry's, his wife Mabel, Terry's son Peter, daughter Teresa, fiance Bob, and grandson Anthony. We realize that there's another daughter, Michelle, who lives in California, could not be here. And is Lori Diamond here? And we also want to thank, I wanted to put this in, Terry was chair for 12 years. And Lori was the secretary of the department for 12 years. And so she deserves at least some sort of recognition of martyrdom, if you know Terry. But now I invite our colleague, Dr. Michael Hollerich, professor of historical theology, to say a few words about Terry before we actually get to the lecture.
I remember Terry saying that about his time as chair, that the worst thing they could ever do to him would be to make him chair again. I've been asked to say a few words tonight about Terry, who died 5 years ago, and just 5 days ago is the death anniversary. Is that right? 11 days. Speaking for myself, and I'm sure for many others, that St. Thomas has never been the same since his passing. We're told we're all unique, but Terry was really unique. They broke the mold. I said in the eulogy that I gave for him at the funeral mass that he was kind of a throwback to an older America, practical, competent, energetic, and forward-looking, always forward-looking. If Terry had been a car, it would have been a car without a reverse gear. He never went in reverse. He was one of those people who are always being asked to do more because they can do more. So I assume it wasn't just because he was one of the few people in our department that had done some coursework in comparative religions in graduate school that he seemed the right person to take the reins when, after 9/11, Father Deese invited the theology department to start a dialogue center with local Muslims, something on the order of what the J. Phillips Center had been doing for quite a long time between Catholics and Jews. Terry had been engaged in informal dialogue for quite a while by then with local Muslims, odd-hoking it the way he always did, just jumping in and trying stuff to see what worked. Sometimes he broke things. That's an American tradition too. And at dinner tonight, we heard some of the stories about his experiments with his chemistry set in the basement of his house that ended up kind of the way that the Mill City Museum on the other side of the river did. He escaped, and so did the house. I myself, I have to be honest with you, was a skeptic when the Muslim Christian Dialogue Center first got launched. I thought it seemed a little bit like hubris, or if you want to use a word from another cultural tradition, chutzpah, to start a dialogue center on Islam when none of us even knew Arabic. So I kept my distance from it, to be honest. But Terry wasn't fazed at all. That's why when in January of 2012, out of the blue, the theology department received an email from Iran announcing without any kind of introductory context broad-minded principles for interreligious dialogue, and then a follow-up email inviting a response. Terry, without much hesitation at all, sent back a courteous and encouraging reply. It turned out that the email author was a young Shiite scholar named Tahir Golestani, who had organized a Muslim-Christian international dialogue at the Mustafa International University in Qom, in Iran, which, to those of you who don't know, is kind of the equivalent of the Vatican in Catholic life. Tahir had sent a mass emailing to dozens of European addresses that he thought might be open to religious dialogue. He got no answers. So he tried again, and Terry replied to this one. That was how long negotiations started and a lot of lobbying with our administration that led to a meeting with these Iranian representatives in Rome that summer. The Benedictines at the College of San Anselmo were our hosts, and for 3 days we sat down with Shiite scholars in full dress, including attending as a group an outdoor Corpus Christi Mass on the lawn in front of St. John Lateran, presided over by Pope Benedict XVI. I remember some Mexican nuns sitting in front of us who, everybody on their folding chairs, turned around and then looked at this row of 7 guys in their turbans and long robes, and they just said in English, "Everybody's welcome here." 1 year after that, after a lot more negotiating, we managed to secure visas from the Iranian government for an even more remarkable meeting in Qom. That one really tested our provost, Sue Huber's, tolerance for risk. 2012 was the year, you may remember, that Argo was showing in the theaters, and she imagined some of her faculty maybe not making it back. I have to tell you, as I told our Iranian host, that when I returned home, that the only time I felt fear in Iran was trying to cross a street in the traffic. We had high hopes that we could bring our Iranian host to St. Thomas the year after that, but conditions changed and that never happened. I'm telling you this because the whole improbable chain of events was pure Terry. I've said of him before that where ecumenical experiment was concerned, he'd pray with anybody that would pray with him, and that included mullahs from theocratic Iran. It was total overreach on his part. I don't know the Farsi word for chutzpah, to engage in dialogue with this people about whom we did later get a reassuring recommendation from Benedictines who had previously worked with Golestani. None of us were trained Islamicists. Terry brought me on board because he had at least enough self-doubt to want a qualified historian around to provide context and intellectual cover. The trouble was that I wasn't qualified, and I knew it. I have to tell you, I have a doctorate from the University of Chicago, which in the history of Christianity, the University of Chicago has one of the great centers for Middle Eastern studies in the U.S., and I had never taken a single course there on Islam or anything else. Thanks to Terry and his invitation to be part of these trips, the payoff for me was a late-in-life, on-the-fly education and stuff I absolutely should have studied a long time ago, and I owe it to him and to his boldness. I won't go into the trips that we took to Turkey and Izmir to meet with Sunni scholars and their visit here, but that was also his doing. It's thanks to him then that if I finally got nudged to start educating myself about a world that has impinged on our own Christian tradition in ways, unfortunately, often fraught and troubled from the time it emerged in the 7th century. I'm not the only person at St. Thomas here who can tell you a story like this. It was Terry's restless mind and his boundless energy and his magnanimity that enriched us all. So it's a pleasure to be here tonight for this inaugural Terence Nichols Memorial Lecture to be given by our guest, Younas Mirza. Thank you.
Well, it is now my honor and privilege, I think, to present Dr. Younas Mirza as our first Terence Nichols Memorial Speaker. He is visiting researcher at Georgetown University, which we know has a great center for Muslim-Christian relations, and is a scholar in residence at Shenandoah University. His current research focuses on the relationship between the Bible and the Qur'an and the shared stories between them. He is co-author of the book, The Bible and the Qur'an, Biblical Figures in the Islamic Tradition, which I do have a copy, which I might have him sign after this, and is published in various journals such as the Journal of American Academy of Religion, the Journal of Quranic Studies, and Christian-Muslim Relations. He teaches courses on the Quran, Islamic movements, biblical and Quranic prophets, marriage and sexuality in Islam and other religions. Tonight he will be reflecting on Muhammad's relationship with Jesus. Please help us welcome him tonight to address this issue. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Steve, for the invitation, and Michael for your words. I want to thank everyone for coming out and being here to remember an important person, Terry Nichols. As I was mentioning to people over dinner, I wish I had the opportunity to meet Terry. He seemed like a remarkable person, a person full of energy, curiosity, someone full of life, and someone that put his life into the Muslim-Christian Dialogue Institute, the center, and devoted his life for interfaith relationships and peaceful relationships between Muslims and Christians. I want to recognize the family for coming to the lecture and sharing some of their thoughts earlier today regarding Terry. I want to thank also the host committee who have been very gracious in bringing me here. They put me into old priest residence, and I found myself praying more since I've arrived. I want to begin first by talking a little bit about Terry Nichols. And in preparation for this inaugural lecture, I want to connect our research that's going on regarding Jesus and Islam with Terry's legacy. First, there's so many things that impressed me about Terry Nichols, whether it's the idea that theology was his second career, that he didn't have training in Islamic studies or even Muslim-Christian relations, and that he was a self-taught person, someone that was edged on by necessity, realizing after 9/11 that it was important to engage in Muslim-Christian dialogue, and realizing that dialogue is more important and more fulfilling than war. And I feel remembering his legacy, especially at this moment and at this time, is so essential because we live in a time of fear, of phobia, of attacks on religious institutions, places of worship. And Terry is someone that reminds us that it's better to engage the other rather than target them. There were certain things that when I read his works, when I watched his videos, when I saw him interact with other people, that stood out. And one of the main concepts that's emerging within interfaith and interreligious studies is the idea of appreciative knowledge. The idea that you can engage the other person, that engage someone of another faith, and not necessarily convert, but appreciate certain things that they do and bring those things back to your own life and have those things enrich who you are as a human being. As Terry says in his last public lecture, The Hope, a Muslim-Christian Dialogue, one can still hold that his or her religion is the fullest expression of God's revelation, but one might still find truth and value in other religions. Muslims believe that the fullness of revelation was given through Muhammad and the Qur'an, yet they can acknowledge revelation in other traditions, especially Judaism and Christianity, and the people of the book. The Christians believe that the fullness of revelation was given through Jesus Christ, but can still acknowledge revelation in Judaism and in Islam and other religions as well. And what strikes me in this passage is his point, but one might still find truth and value in other religions. And this really struck me because when we engage in interfaith or interreligious dialogue, the question is, why do we engage in that dialogue? What is the outcome? How will we benefit? How will we learn from one another? Because if you are someone who believes in the completeness of your revelation or the message or your particular religion, then why engage the other? And Terry reminds us here that interreligious dialogue is so essential because you still have the opportunity to learn from the other person. And that interaction may enrich your own understanding of your personal faith and give you the opportunity to become closer to God. Also, as Terry says, so the many Muslims I have known have inspired me to deepen my own faith. I can say that I'm a better Catholic as a result of my friendship and conversations with Muslims. Dialogue with them has deepened my own relationship with God. And this last point really strikes me as well. The idea that dialogue with Muslims, even though Terry was a devout Catholic, helped him in his journey to God. He was someone that taught about God in the theology department, someone who taught about the afterlife the semester before he passed away. And in his journey to God, he felt it was important to engage with Muslims, engage with people of other faiths, because he understood that if he wanted to become closer to God, he had to spend time with people who also had the same goal and the same objective. We also see that the idea of appreciative knowledge is something that people that are close to Terry or work with him also realized and valued. For example, in his obituary, Zafar Siddiqui, he says, "I first met Terry at an interfaith gathering almost a decade ago. His sincere, affable, and humble personality immediately had a strong impact on me. Having studied in a Catholic school since I was in preschool, I have great memories of interacting with some wonderful representatives of the Catholic community. And Terry reminded me of them." And the sentence that is so important here is how he describes Terry as someone who was sincere, that his interaction with the Muslim community, with people of other religious traditions, was not politically motivated. He didn't have an ulterior motive in that interaction. and that people that interacted with him understood that he was sincere, that he wanted to become closer to God. He wanted the best for both religions. He wanted the best for humanity. He was affable, kind person, a person that had a gregarious personality, someone who you wanted to work with, that was easy to get along with. And he was humble, an essential characteristic of interfaith and interreligious dialogue. Because if you go in with the objective, with the goal of only preaching, then you are not listening. If you go in the goal of only teaching, then you're not learning. You're not learning from the other person and not learning how they may help you in your own personal, religious, and spiritual journey. And the idea that he was a humble person allowed him to engage in this important work. Also, the final point that he makes is that Zafar was someone who went to Catholic school. He was someone who interacted with Catholics at a young age. And since I've been here, I've had the opportunity to interact with many of the Muslim students here on campus who are coming to a Catholic university, who are interacting with Catholics on a daily basis. And what Zafar is saying is that when he interacted with Terry in these interfaith and interreligious dialogues, he recollected, it reminded him of these positive experiences that he had with the Catholic community when he was young. And then sometimes I know as professors, it can be sometimes challenging or even frustrating that when we're teaching, we don't know the impact that we have on students. We don't know how they are understanding, interpreting what we're saying, and how they're going to take it with them in the future. But the idea here is that years in the future, someone may remember us as educators and teachers because of a personal relationship that they had with someone like us. The second point that really impresses me about Terry, and it's something that Michael also mentioned, was the idea of experiential knowledge. That he was not someone that only interacted with Muslims simply through reading books, opening up the Qur'an or the prophetic hadith. But he was someone that said that I want to interact with Muslims, whether that be in Turkey or whether that be in Iran, or whether that be the local Muslim community here in Minnesota. And that he understood that if you want to learn about the other, you have to engage the other. You have to experience the other. You have to go to their home countries. You have to go to their houses. You have to socialize with them. And then through that interpersonal experience, you can be enriched. And that enriching experience is something that he carried on and shared with others. As Michael says in his obituary that he wrote shortly after Terry died, the polarization that has marked Catholic life for decades now probably prevented some from recognizing that Terry was never a dogmatic authoritarian, but someone who lived by and for argument and learning, and someone who was always open to what experience might tell him, even at unsettled previous patterns of thought. And once again, what strikes me in Michael's words is someone who was always open to what experience might tell him. And the idea that experience is so important in learning. That if you want to learn about difference, if you want to learn about a group of people, you have to spend time with them. You have to be in their presence. You have to become their friend, their companion. That learning about someone of another religious tradition is not something simply of picking up their scripture and reading it, but asking those people of that community, how do you understand your scripture? How do you live it? How do you implement it within your own life? And here is a picture of Terry, engaged in that experiential learning, engaged with Dr. Adil, Jamal Bedwi, and Zafar Siddiqui, Muslims from the local community, and Muslims who were internationally renowned speakers. So I want to bring these 2 points that Terry teaches us and Terry reminds us. The idea of appreciative knowledge, that yes, you can engage the other with the intention, with the hope that you can learn something from them. And that you can approach the other with humility and understanding and coming with the realization that that interaction may make you learn something more deeper about yourself. And the second idea of experiential knowledge, that we can't simply learn about others through the media, through cable news, through the newspaper, but we have to go into their spaces. We have to go to their mosques. We have to go to their countries. We have to go to their houses. And I want to take these principles and see how they are implemented within the Qur'an, and how the Qur'an takes these certain principles and shows that there is a deep connection with Christians, a deep identification with Christians. And even though Islam is a different religion than Christianity, and has differences regarding the definition of monotheism, of understanding the definition of the one true God, there are still many similarities that we often overlook. And similarities in how the Muslim community, especially the early Muslim community, identified with Christians. And in building this argument, I want to draw from a Christian scholar. As a Muslim myself, I've studied overseas, studying Arabic, studying with religious clerics, but I've also studied at places like Georgetown and studied with scholars who were scholars of Islam, but were Catholic, who were Christian. And I found myself trying to implement many of the points that we learned from Terry. The idea of appreciative knowledge, that even though someone may not share the same religion of myself, I can still learn something about them. And I can learn something about my own faith from someone who is a non-Muslim. And I've learned that it's important for me also to engage in experiential knowledge. It's important for me to go into Christian spaces, to go into churches, go into chapels, be a student at a Jesuit Catholic university, at the same time recognizing and honoring that legacy that allowed me to be there and benefit from that educational experience. And Neil Robinson is a Christian scholar of Islam who comes from a Catholic background, and he writes about the Qur'an, and he has a special interest in the biblical Christian figures that are represented within the Islamic tradition. And in preparing for this talk, I had the opportunity to read this book, and then hopefully I'll share some of Robinson's findings, but also build upon them with my own insights. The first theme I want to speak about is the idea of persecution. That the early Muslim community was a community that was small, nascent, and they were fighting for their survival. It's said within the seerah literature, the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, that the early Muslim community was a handful of people. And by the time they had left, migrating to Medina, there are only around 70 to 80 people. And the Qur'an, the early revelations, the Meccan surahs, the Meccan verses, they speak about this idea of persecution. They speak about how the Muslim community was targeted and how they were not given the opportunity to freely practice their own faith. And in this context of talking about the Muslim persecution, the Qur'an identifies with Christians and identifies with Christians who also went through persecution and went through difficult and challenging times. In Surah 85, or the chapter 85, 1 through 9, Surah Al-Buruj, it identifies with early Christian communities who were also persecuted because of their faith. By the sky with its towering constellations, by the promised day, by the witness and that which is witnessed, damned were the makers of the trench, the makers of the fuel-stroke fire. They sat down to watch what they were doing to the believers. Their only grievance against them was their faith in God, the mighty, the praiseworthy, to whom all control over the heavens and earth belongs. God is witness over all things. Here, the commentators are in consensus that this refers to a group of Christians who were persecuted because of their faith. Because of their faith in God, because of their faith in Christianity, they became martyrs. And because of that faith challenged certain political and social structures, they became a threat to the larger political system. And the verse that is key in this passage is that they were only grievance against them was their faith in God. إِلَّا أَن يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ, as the Arabic says. That the only problem, the only thing that they did is they believed. And in Arabic, the word yu'minu is related to having faith, iman. And the idea that this early community were mu'min, that they were believers. And this word is essential because scholars at the University of Chicago, such as Fred Donner, have spoken about the early Muslim community as a believing community, that they were believers in monotheism. They were mu'minun, believers in the idea that God was one, and challenging the structures, the polytheistic structures of the Meccan society. So here, the idea is that these Christians had faith, that they had iman. And what did they have iman in? What did they have faith in? The idea of God, that he was mighty and he's praiseworthy. And these verses are come to comfort the early Muslim community, to comfort them and say, yes, things are challenging, things are tough. Yes, you're being excommunicated. Yes, you're being tortured. Some of you are being martyred, but know that there are early religious communities, communities that had faith, that also went through difficult and trying situations. And these verses, especially the Meccan verses, are so essential in our times, where we know that there are minority Muslim communities here in the United States and in Western countries that are often targeted because of their faith, because of their religion. And we also know Christian minority communities throughout the world who are also targeted because of their particular religious tradition. The second theme that appears is the idea of the helpers. That as Muhammad traveled from Mecca to Medina, there were two groups of people. The first being the Muhajirun, the people who immigrated, the people who are indigenous Meccans, people who believed in God, that followed Muhammad's movement. But as they traveled to Medina, there was another group of people called the Ansar, the people who were the helpers, the people that came to the support of Muhammad and the early religious community. And this word in Arabic is important because it appears in the Qur'an in certain Christian contexts. For instance, in this particular chapter, we see that the Qur'an is encouraging the Muslim community to be like the disciples. As it says, you who believe, be God's helpers, Ansarullah. As Jesus, son of Mary, said to his disciples, to the disciples, who will come with me to help God? The disciples said, we shall be God's helpers. Some of the children of Israel believed and some disbelieved. We supported the believers against their opponents, and they were the ones who came out victorious. And what is fascinating about this verse is that the idea of Ansar is used 3 times. And it's used in reference to the disciples, that the Qur'an is saying to the believers, the mu'minun, the ones who have faith, that have iman, telling them, you should help Muhammad in his efforts, just as Jesus, the son of Mary, turned to his disciples and asked them to be helpers in his cause. And then the disciples responded, yes, we shall be God's helpers. We also find this word not only in the prophetic literature, the seerah, but we also see it within the Qur'an itself when it speaks about the Ansar, speaking about the helpers in Medina that came to the aid of the Prophet Muhammad. As it says in the verse 9:100, God will be well pleased with the first immigrants and helpers, Ansar, and those who follow them in good deeds, and they will be well pleased with him. He has prepared gardens, graced with flowing streams for them, there to remain forever. That is the supreme triumph. And the verse begins speaking about these two groups of people, the immigrants, the Muhajirun, and the Ansar. So the times where we have the Ansar in the Quran referencing actual groups of people, it first begins by referencing the disciples who came to the aid of Jesus. And the same word is used to reference the helpers of Muhammad, who actually came to support him and his cause of monotheism. Verses like this led Ibn Taymiyyah, who was arguably the most famous and influential in modern times medieval theologian, to say the disciples are truthful in transmitting from Jesus. They are not accused of intentionally lying about him. And in his treatise on this particular verse and on the disciples, he says that the disciples were similar to the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, that they were messengers, they spread the message of Muhammad, they spread the message of Jesus, but they were not divinely protected in their efforts. They're human beings, just like the companions were. The third theme that appears in terms of this relationship between Muhammad and Jesus is the idea of mortality. And Islam came with the conception that there were prophets, and there were many prophets before, but these prophets were human beings. They were mortal, and they passed away. And Muhammad presented himself within the prophetic literature as someone who was going to die, and someone who would not come back to the world. And the Qur'an speaks to this theme of mortality, and Muhammad's mortality in particular. But Muhammad is only a messenger before whom many messengers have been and gone. If he died or was killed, will you revert to your own ways? And here the Qur'an is speaking to the reality that is this religion, this new religion of Islam, is it simply a cult? Is it simply following the charismatic personality of Muhammad, or is it something greater? Is it something that is anchored in God, in worship, and in monotheism? And the verse is telling the early community, telling the companions, that he's a messenger. And there have been other messengers before, and he will die. And if you might be killed, you should not revert to your own pagan ways. Rather, you should continue to worship God as he should be worshipped. And this verse in 3:144 is remarkably similar to another verse in the Qur'an, in 575. And it has the exact same structure. It says the Messiah, son of Mary, was only a messenger. Other messengers have come and gone before him. And the Arabic here, وَقَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِ, that the idea that there have been other messengers that have come before you. That Jesus, in the Quranic eyes, in the eyes of Muhammad, was a prophet, and that he passed away, and there will be other messengers. So the idea that both Muhammad and Jesus are prophets, that they're messengers, and that they will pass away. The final point that I want to raise is the idea of servitude, the idea of being the servant of God. And that Muhammad himself saw him and the early Muslim community as Abdullah, that the servants of God, and that they were there to worship him, to pray, to give alms, to fast during the month of Ramadan, and to go on pilgrimage. And that he also, in his work and in his engagement with others, spoke about the other prophets in a similar manner. As I spoke to a class earlier today, there's an entire chapter in the Qur'an called Surat al-Maryam, or the chapter on Mary. And that many Christians may not know that Mary is mentioned 34 times in the Qur'an, and that there are more Quranic verses about her than biblical ones. And that Mary is seen as a protagonist in herself. She is seen as someone that receives revelation, that she interacts with the angels, that she brings the message of Jesus back to her people. And this surah is remarkable and fascinating because it's understood to come from these early Meccan periods. This period where the early community was persecuted, that they felt alone and excommunicated, that they felt that there was no one to support them, and that this particular surah was understood to be presented to the Christian king of Najran, that when they went to Abyssinia, a story in the prophetic literature speaks about part of the Muslim community in Mecca traveling to Ethiopia, to Abyssinia, and then confronting and being in the presence of a Christian king. And he asked them to speak of their religion, and that the Muslim community recites this chapter. They recite Surah Maryam. And part of how the king responds is that he cries and then he draws a line in the sand and he says, the difference between you and I are just the difference between this line. That there seems to be similarity and identification between Muslims and Christians. And what we see in contemporary and modern scholarship is that we're trying to understand how these stories function within the prophetic career and within the biography of Muhammad and the companions. That in this state of desperation, in this state of fear, of excommunication, of existential threat, they look to Mary. They look to Jesus. And in the Qur'an, it's remarkable how Mary actually goes away from her people. She is someone who goes to a desolate area and gives birth to Jesus. And in a similar way, scholars have pointed to the fact that Muhammad, when he receives his initial revelations, he goes to the cave of Hira. He leaves his people. And as the biographies tell us, that as the community began to grow, they were boycotted. And they were made to leave their people, leave the actual city of Mecca and live on the outskirts. And in many ways, the community identified with Mary and her struggle with her people. In a particular chapter towards the end of the segment on Mary, the Qur'an says, she went back to her people, carrying the child, and they said, Mary, you have done something terrible. Sister of Aaron, your father was not an evil man, your mother was not unchaste. She pointed at him. They said, how can we converse with an infant, the infant Jesus? But he said, I am a servant of God. He has granted me the scripture, made me a prophet, made me blessed wherever I may be. He commanded me to pray, to give alms as long as I live, to cherish my mother. He did not make me domineering or graceless. Peace was on me the day I was born, and will be on me the day I die, and the day I'm raised to life again. Such was Jesus, son of Mary. And what emerges in this particular segment of the chapter of Mary of Surah Maryam is the idea of the people confronting her, people challenging her. After she's excommunicated and after she goes out into the desert, she comes back. She comes back to her people with this message. And they are astonished and they are curious and they ask her, how could this be? How could you have committed infidelity? How could you commit this having relationships that led to the birth of this child? Accusing her of her honor, accusing her of her character. And in a similar way, you could argue that Muhammad was challenged by his community, by the early Muslim community, by the early pagan community, accusing him of doing something that was dishonorable by bringing the message of monotheism. And they say to her, how could this be? And she responds, pointing to Jesus himself. And they ask, how can we converse with a child? This makes no sense. And the next part, we see that in the Qur'an, the baby Jesus responds and speaks up and defines himself, who he is, defends his mother, and honors the idea of faith and prayer. But he said, I'm a servant of God, Abdullah, that I'm here to serve God. This is my goal. This is my objective. He has granted me the scripture, made me a prophet, made me blessed wherever I may be. He commanded me to pray, to give alms as long as I live, to cherish my mother, to be good to her. Peace was on me the day I was born and will be on the day I die and the day I'm raised to life again. And scholars such as Neil Robinson, they say this is a remarkable statement because after defining himself that he is a servant of God, that he talks about his prophecy, that he has a scripture. And part of his responsibility as a prophet is to implement that, to pray, to help the poor, to help the needy. And then he speaks about his own mortality, that he will die and then eventually be resurrected. Robinson says this is something that Muhammad himself could have said. That when we define who Muhammad is, it's almost identical to this particular phrase, where Jesus is defining himself as a servant of God, as someone who has a scripture that is commanded to pray and give alms. That the baby Jesus, in many ways, is speaking about prophecy, speaking about not only about himself, but about the later Muslim community. To conclude, I want to once again highlight the themes of appreciative and experiential knowledge. That we see with Terry that he was someone that appreciated other religious traditions, and in particular appreciated the religion of Islam. And he was someone that had faith and someone who wanted to get closer to God. And he understood that his interactions with Muslims allowed him to do that and allowed him on his particular journey. And he was someone that was not afraid. He was someone who was curious. As we spoke and learned about earlier, he was someone that even in his home environment was conducting chemistry experiments, blowing things up. And in a similar way, he brought that energy to Muslim-Christian dialogue. He's someone that was willing to take risks, willing to travel to Iran, to go to Turkey, to interact with Muslims. And I feel in a similar way in these particular Quranic verses that we see that the Qur'an, the early Muslim community, and the Prophet Muhammad himself appreciated Christianity. Even though the community would separate and define itself on its own, there was appreciation of the different struggles that they went through, appreciation of how they coalesced around Jesus, an appreciation of the struggles that Mary went through. And there was this idea of experiential knowledge as well, that we're not simply going to live in Mecca, but we're actually going to travel to Medina. And in Medina, there are stories that they interacted with Christians, that there were Christian delegations that were there, that there were early Muslims who traveled to Ethiopia and Abyssinia and interacted with Christian communities in Africa. And that part of this experiential knowledge, part of this experience that they had led them to develop their own understanding and their own faith and articulation of Islam. And through the examples that we've spoken about, we've seen the idea of persecution. That Muslims faced persecution in the early Meccan period. And that persecution that they faced was something that early Christians faced as well. That many of them were martyrs. Many of them were tortured. Many of them went through a great deal of hardship to articulate and define their faith. And I feel this is relevant today because many times as Muslims in America, we may see Islamophobia as something particularly affecting the Muslim community here. But it's important for us as Muslims to realize that Christians historically have also been persecuted, and that Christian minorities today throughout the world have also been subject of hate crimes and attacks. Secondly, you see the idea of support. That the Muslim community was small, it was nascent, it was struggling to survive. And the Qur'an comes and it tells the community to be ansar, to be the helpers, be there to support the Prophet Muhammad, to support the call of monotheism. And this idea of support is crucial because you cannot have a prophet or a charismatic figure or even a religion that will survive without the help of the followers. And that the followers are essential in making any religious movement successful. And the Qur'an tells the companions, tells the early community, be ansar. And be ansar, be helpers just like the disciples were to Jesus. And once again, this is so important because we live in a time of persecution, of struggle, and the idea of allies is essential. That we find allies within our religious communities, within our sectarian divides, but even also outside our religious communities, and realize that it's important for us to be a community, to practice our faith, we need the support of others. The third concept that we discussed, the idea of mortality. That Muhammad, that the Qur'an envisions prophets as being mortal figures, that they come with a message, but then they pass away, and they'll be resurrected on the Day of Judgment. And I think this point is remarkable in the sense that Muhammad himself in the Qur'an saw Jesus in a similar light, realized that he was a human being and he was someone that passed away and also will eventually be raised again. And in interreligious, interfaith dialogue, I think it's essential that we realize that mortality is the final destination. That regardless of whatever we accomplish in this life, we will eventually pass away and we will eventually encounter God and a potential afterlife. And lastly, the idea of servitude. That the Qur'an speaks, when Jesus speaks, he defines himself as the servant of God, that he's there to serve God. And the Muslim community itself saw themselves in the service of God, that they were Abdullah. And that name is a name that you find within different Muslim communities, a name that defines the faith itself. That what is a Muslim? A Muslim is someone who submits themselves, is someone who worships, someone who serves God. And as Terry reminds us, what is the purpose of our life? What is the purpose of our various religions? It is to get closer to God. The purpose is to serve God. And if we have that as our goal and as our objective, then we can come together on more common and similar terms. And finally, I've given all of these examples to show that there is interconnectedness between Islam and Christianity, that our scriptures share certain common figures, whether they be Jesus or Mary or the disciples. And I give these examples because we live in a time of intense polarization, where we see the West being defined against Islam or Islam being defined against the West. But if we realize that our scriptures are interconnected, that they build off each other, then we have the hope for the future of Christian-Muslim dialogue. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Younas. For me, I was thinking of these patterns in terms of my Franciscan heritage and thinking Francis of Assisi. This is like, so I'm like, but we have time for questions here. So we asked to kind of stay toward the topic at hand. So if there's anyone with questions, we do have microphones here. And
thank you, Dr. Younas, for your presentation. Just question, in Islam, first, some scholar debate regarding Mary, that she is a prophet or not in Islam. What's your opinion about that? And secondly, is there any kind of cycle for the prophets in Islam? Like they receive a message, they are not, their community doesn't receive them well, then they are persecuted, and then God intervened to save them. So is there any pattern in prophecy or prophets in Islam? And maybe that's why there is a similarity between Jesus and the Prophet Muhammad. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I'd love to hear your thoughts also, Dr. Ali, who also teaches here regarding Islamic studies.
Professor, not doctor yet.
Not very, okay. Hopefully soon. So so that's a fascinating question. That's a question that I'm currently researching. So in my preliminary research, I found that there were certain medieval Muslim scholars like Ibn Hazm and al-Qurtubi who were familiar with this idea and actually argued within their Quranic commentaries that Mary was a prophet. And the idea is that this is built upon the fact that in the Qur'an, Mary is approached by a spirit, approached by a messenger of the Lord. And this messenger communicates to her and tells her that she's going to have the baby Jesus. And what Qurtubi and Hazm argue is that this messenger was an angel. This messenger was Gabriel. This messenger was the same angel that approached the Prophet Muhammad. And I think that similarity is important because the idea is that prophets gain revelation or they have this direct communication with God. And if they have this direct communication with God, then they are understood to be an elevated religious and spiritual state. So there is that argument that you find within the Quranic literature that anyone that has this communication with God or with God's messengers is understood to be a prophet. And that opens a lot of really interesting questions. As we discussed earlier in the class I taught today, is that if we understand Mary to be a prophet and we understand her to be similar or even superior to other male prophets, how can we see her potentially as a role model, a modern role model, not only just for women, but for men as well? And the point here that's important is that once you put Mary into the status of a prophet, she becomes a source of emulation for the entire Muslim community, not simply that of women or a particular religious sects. So this was an idea that was prevalent within the medieval times, but it lost traction. Other scholars said, well, she is someone that maybe had interaction with these angels, but she didn't bring a scripture, right? She didn't bring a particular message. There are other verses in the Qur'an that speak about the men, al-rijal, being messengers. But others will counter, such as Ibn Hazm and al-Qurtubi, who say the idea is not simply men, but the idea they're human messengers, not ones necessarily that are divine. So that is kind of a point to think about, to contemplate, and I think a potential bridge between Muslims and Christians to think about the role of Mary within the different religious traditions and the role that she continues to play. And I think to your second question about the formula, right? How does these certain prophetic figures work? Part of my research when I worked on the book, the Bible and the Qur'an, biblical figures in the Islamic tradition, I was really interested in these prophetic stories. And as many of you may know, Younas, my name, is a prophet in the Qur'an who is known as Jonah in the Bible and the biblical tradition. So they have a lot of similarities. Many of the Islamic prophets are also found within the biblical tradition. But what's unique is that the Islamic literature began to have a genre called the stories of the prophets, the Qisas al-Anbiya. And in that literature, they would put different chapters for each prophet. One chapter on Adam, then another one on Jonah, another one on Ibrahim. But part of my research is interested in how these stories function within the life of the Prophet Muhammad and the struggles of the early Muslim community. So, to go into your question about the formula, right? So there are many of these prophetic stories in the early period, in the early Meccan period, that have this formula, that they go to their people, they are rejected by their people, and eventually those people are either destroyed, and in one particular case, in the story of Jonah, they all follow the messenger. But there is a fascinating, if you focus closely, that you see that each prophet functions in a different way, in a different time in the biography of Prophet Muhammad. So for instance, when the idea that there was a point in the biography of the Prophet Muhammad that he was planning on leaving his people, and it talks about the great desperation that he felt. So at that time, Jonah appears, right? And this is the only time in the Qur'an that Younas appears in the Qur'an. And the story of Jonah is one where he leaves his people, but eventually comes back and they believe in him. So the Qur'an, in essence, is telling Muhammad, don't follow this footsteps, right? Don't leave your people. Look what happened to Jonah, right? He was swallowed by a whale, right? You don't want to follow that similar path. And in a similar way, I see with Mary that there are a lot of parallels in this late kind of Meccan period where the community was struggling, they were boycotted, excommunicated, living on the outskirts of Mecca, of the city, and that Mary is seen in a similar light, that she leaves her people, but then eventually comes back. They question what she brings, but they eventually believe in her because Jesus speaks and announces who she is. So to answer your question is we should look at the formulas of the stories but within this larger religious movement. How does Jesus function within the biography of Muhammad? How does Jesus function within this very new religious movement? And then how does he function later on in the Islamic tradition?
Thank you very much, Doctor. I'm wondering if you could address just a couple of things. The first one is, so I teach Dante regularly, and the amazing thing about Dante is that while he's critical he's critical of Muhammad and Islam in certain respects, as you could imagine a 14th century Christian to be, he in no way actually others Muslims. He regards them as part of, or a breakaway part of Christianity, in fact, right? Which is, I'm sure, incorrect in its own way, but nonetheless, there's not that othering. And in fact, he admires Muslim thinkers very highly. And in fact, I think it's pretty clear we wouldn't even have the comedy if it weren't for the prior tradition of Islamic poetry, particularly Sufi poetry, but all sorts of Islamic visionary poetry that Dante knew. So clearly, at some point in the past in the West, there may have been, this is, and Dante's knowledge of Islam is largely dependent on the stuff that's coming back through the Crusades. So that's not like a picnic, right, between the two groups of people. But nonetheless, there seemed to be like a higher regard for each other. And so when do you see historically the kind of demonization of Islam in the West, where it becomes just a kind of like pure bogeyman, where we're not even supposed to be interested in it or anything except to know that it's just really bad and all that kind of stuff? Where do you see that happening historically?
So those are great points, and so the first point that you're raising about Dante, right, and it's a remarkable observation, because many of us were familiar with Dante and he putting Muhammad in certain parts of the hellfire and so forth, but we don't know these other aspects that you're alluding to. And this is, I think, a problem, something that I try to focus on in my talk, is that we sometimes remember the polemical aspects of these figures, and we shouldn't not speak about those polemical aspects. We need to speak about both. And there are Quranic verses that are critical of the Trinity and critical of the idea that Jesus is the Son of God, but there are also these verses that I try to highlight in my presentation today. So we have to understand the complexity, right, of Dante, understand the complexity of a lot of medieval Christian thinkers. So as you're speaking, there is a medieval Christian also maybe that had this complex view of Islam, right? So in his refutation of Islam, Nicholas Cusa, he also refutes Islam. But then in particular verses regarding Mary and Jesus, he says, well, there might be some divine revelation here because they're praising Mary. So I really appreciate your approach that we shouldn't just put Dante in that category and not also realize that he had this appreciation or he had this understanding that they're not particularly the other. In terms of your second question, it's a really important one, and I don't have an exact answer. Maybe the others have greater insights. But the idea of Islam being a religion that's different, a religion that is similar, that is other in a sense, starts early on, right? But I think going back to John Damascus, but I think what we're seeing today in the modern kind of period of this kind of very nationalistic kind of rhetoric that we're experiencing, that is a very kind of modern, I think, thing. That people seeing certain spaces, certain countries as solely Christian, for example, or even solely Islamic, that is something that leads to genocide, that leads to persecution. That when you see that this is my house, right, this is my territory, and only people my particular religious tradition can exist in that particular place, that leads to you wanting to purify, right, your territory, and having certain people leave your particular country. And this idea of this kind of modern nationalism, I think, is very recent, coming from the 19th and 20th century. But yes, of course, there are polemics going on between Muslims and Christians since the beginning. But they still occupied similar spaces, right? There was this more kind of sense of empire, that you could have an empire that was maybe Islamic or even Christian, but that had different pockets of religious communities. But this very modern nationalism, even with ISIS, for example, who tried to establish a state and say it's an Islamic state, and then we have to purify that state of all those who are non-Muslim, is very, I believe, modern. So thanks for those points.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I really enjoyed your presentation, especially the particular points you brought out. My son is Muslim, and when he told me the birth story of Jesus, I laughed with hilarity. It was completely different, obviously, than the one we've heard about in Bethlehem, and that she was actually at the root of the tree, and she just needed to shake for food to come in. Where do you recommend finding a good translation of that chapter of the Quran? Is it online, or I've got that green one, but I don't remember what it's called, or who
Yeah.
the translator was.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you might maybe Yusuf Ali, the green,
Yes.
the Holy Quran, so the meaning of the Holy Quran. So that's also a very good one. That Quran translation is well known for its precision in English language. It builds up upon the old King James Bible kind of language. It's very old English, tried to speak about the Quran in these old kind of elevated terms, and that's why I use this kind of Shakespearean and kind of middle-aged English. The translation I use for my presentation is Muhammad Abdul Halim, and it's published by Oxford University Press. And I like this translation because it doesn't use some of the archaic thy and thou, which is sometimes difficult to get through. It's difficult to assign to students, which have and difficult for myself even to kind of understand. So this is more readable. It's almost kind of like a novel. You can get through it pretty easily. There's also a new study Quran that I would recommend. It has a new translation, but then it also has commentary. So the commentary is very helpful to see what these classical exegetes said about particular stories within the Quran, particular verses, and specifically the Mary chapter. And I think in your personal, life, I think, I would say that's remarkable. I think you're an example maybe of appreciative and experiential knowledge, right? Of being able to live in a family that's pluralistic. I know that's challenging. I know many of our families, our extended families in particular, live in pluralistic families. So we encounter this interfaith, interreligious dialogue on a more frequent basis. So.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for coming today. I really admire your speech today. Thank you. So I had two questions. My first one was, from my understanding in the Islamic perspective, Jesus mentioned that the Prophet Muhammad will be coming. He said that, or he hinted that someone will come after me named Ahmed, and that's the Muhammad, Ahmed. How does that play out from the biblical perspective, or from what you know, and how is that played out in the Christian tradition, and how is that mentioned? Also, my other question was, from what I knew, I thought Jesus or Isa was alive when he was raised to heaven, he didn't die. I thought he was ascended to heaven. Can you further go explain that and further go into that? Thank you.
Great. Yeah, those are great questions, great points. So regarding the first one, that there is a Quranic verse that says that Jesus says that someone after me will come named Ahmed. Ba'd ismuhu Ahmed, right? That after me, somebody will come named Ahmed. Now, that leads to a lot of interesting discussion in early Muslim times, medieval times, even in the modern period. So, what does this mean, right? So it's not Muhammad, right? It's the most praiseworthy one, but it's scholars have understood this to be Muhammad. So in the biblical tradition and within Christian and Jewish scholars, there's no similar kind of passage, right? We don't have explicitly saying Muhammad will come in the New Testament or in the in the Torah. However, there is, verses that talk about the parcelet, right? That there will be someone that will come and be and support and becoming an aid. So there is a lot of early Muslim exegesis of biblical passages that argued that Muhammad was, the parcelet, that he was the one that this biblical verse speaks about that will come and aid. And then Christian scholars would come back and they refute this and saying, no, that's not the case. So that is something found within the Muslim tradition, that Jesus is foreshadowing the coming of Muhammad. That obviously is not, reciprocated in the Christian and Jewish communities. But the question remains: is this something that Jesus may have said, on his own? Was it not something that not incorporated in the New Testament? Is it something unique to the Qur'an? And I find it's something unique to the Qur'an, right? That there are certain stories that you find in the Qur'an that you don't find in the biblical tradition. So one of them is the baby Jesus, right, speaking, right? That is something unique. You don't find a parallel. There's also the verse that you talked about also is unique to the Qur'an. So, and then remind me of your second question is? Raised to heaven, right? So this is a debate, a question regarding, the crucifixion and him, being raised to heaven. So it clearly says in the Qur'an that he says, I'm going to die, right? So how does this manifest itself, right? That is also an exegetical question. So the majority of Muslim scholars that I have read, speak about these verses in the Qur'an that allude to the crucifixion, and that the verse says that they did not kill him, but it looked or appeared to them that he was killed. And that verse has led to a lot of debate. What does that mean, that it made to appear? So many Muslim scholars contend that he was substituted, right? And they like to pick on Judas, right? That Judas was the one that was made to look like Jesus, and he was the one that was crucified, right? Not Jesus himself, right? Jesus was raised to heaven, right? And he didn't die in that particular way. However, other Muslim scholars like Ibn Hazm, which I mentioned before, and even many modern scholars are making this point, is that the verse is saying that the enemies of Jesus, they thought that they killed him, right? That they thought that it was part of the divine plan, or they thought themselves that they are the ones that killed or murdered Jesus. But it was actually part of God's plan, right? That it was actually not them who killed Jesus, but God raised Jesus' soul, right? So you have both opinions within the tradition, and this idea of him being raised, right, is very much there. At the same time, he's spoken about as a prophet and as a mortal prophet, as someone who passed away. So great, thanks so much for those points.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khairan. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Regarding the question you asked earlier about what would be the best translation of the meaning of the Quran, there is no the best translation of the meaning of the Quran. There are too many. And I have studied all of them to find out what would be the best. So far, what I found out through my studying for so many years, the best among them is the one by Yusuf Ali. Yusuf Ali happened to be not an Arab, but an Indian. And he did a great job, especially with the commentary there. But my very humble recommendation for anyone who would like to look at the translation of the meaning of the Quran, look at it, Yusuf Ali, look at the commentary, and also find some books of the interpretation of the meaning of Quran. We do have many of them, and they are available. I can just mention one thing. It was mentioned by our great speaker, Younas, about the word al-iman, iman. And the translation, all of the verses he referred to is belief. But as a matter of fact, this is not an accurate translation for the word iman. If you look at the definition of iman in Islam, it does have 6 pillars. Al-iman, أن تؤمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر والقدر خيره وشره. Now, and to believe in God, to believe in angels, to believe in the unseen, to believe in the day of judgment, and so on and so forth. Another definition, الإيمان ما وقر في القلب وصدقه العمل. That has been penetrated deeply in your heart and it has been translated in your action. The definition of Iman. Even my daughter, her name is Iman, and once in a while she debates with me, Dad, what is the definition of my name? Is it faith? I said, no. I said, for everyone, when I tell him or her or them the meaning of my name, I should mention those 6 pillars of Islam, of Iman. I said, yes. I said, why you name me Iman? This is the problem of the translation. Even a piece of poetry, when you translate it to any other languages, it would lose its essence. So with the translation of the Quran, I would say the best way, learn Arabic language. Thank you.
So, this is some great points that you raised, and I hope your daughter knows Arabic, right? So she gets to know her own name well. Is that the idea of the translation is very important. I just want to add that Yusuf Ali, he's known also to be very precise in his language. He was someone who was a non-Arab, someone who studied English literature. So it comes across that he understands language and how to translate it into to English. The only drawback, I think, is sometimes the archaic kind of language that he uses and so forth. That may be challenging for some people. And I think that that point about that there's multiple translations and that there are multiple interpretations, right? So this is so important that when we read other people's scriptures, we may come to a conclusion, oh, this verse means this or that verse means that. But the reality is that there are multiple interpretations, and each religious community has a tradition of commentary, right? And that we have to ask the other, right? We have to ask the Muslim community, we have to ask the Christian community, okay, what does this mean in the Bible? What does this mean in the Qur'an? And then ourselves, we have to bring our own knowledge and experiences to the text to interpret it. So the various different Quranic translations are different commentaries also on the Qur'an. They're not simply translations, but they're commentaries. And I think it's also important, I agree, the idea of learning the original languages, whether they're Hebrew or Greek or Arabic. These are arguably the best way to better understand our various scriptures.
I just want to conclude with that image, that photo that we have of Terry was right down here. And a number of those dialogues that took place, because the Muslim Christian Dialogue Center took place here. So Terry was here just not that long ago. And I want to point out that he is not here, but he has been here. And I really believe that. I think the spirit of Terry, and I think it's very important that we started out with you, and especially to take that much time and to get to know the Terry you did not know, personally, but you really captured that essence, I believe, and weaved it into what you presented to us tonight. So I want to congratulate you on the spirit of Terry Nichols is here. Thank you.